So I wanted to start with some more general remarks. So at the center of the concept of occulture, which of course this series of workshop is based around, stands the apparent tension between the presumed hiddenness and deviance of the occult on the one hand, and the increasing realization that the occult is ordinary, everyday, and out in the open. Gone are the days when we assume the occult to be the province of secret elites. Instead, it is the province of open secrets. The rhetoric of the hidden remains, but it is published and marketed to a broad audience. Gone too are the days when the occult was assumed to be the province of the damned margins of society, the deviant outsiders who reject science and rationality along with piety and morality. If occulture knows a class, as we already heard, it is the educated urban middle class. And while it occasionally preserves a mildly oppositional pose, it is frequently attracted to the rhetoric of rationality and tied to the construction of serious worldviews that supply meanings, values, and the moral compass. Indeed, as Christopher Partridge puts it, citing cultural theorist Raymond Williams, occulture is, quote, a whole way of life, the common meanings, unquote, of a society. Partridge was, of course, developing his notion of occulture as a deceptively powerful form of re-enchantment from the study of contemporary spirituality, especially as it intersects with popular culture. However, the means through which the occulture is produced and disseminated to a broad population are much older, and Partridge himself even suggests that occulture is historically a feature of all societies. Now, myself, I resist the notion that occulture is universal, which is kind of the idea you get from Partridge sometimes, preferring to focus instead of how changes in mediatization, that is, how social interactions are structured around media technologies and information infrastructures, have changed the cultural fabric of societies by providing communicative spaces and flows of knowledge that previously did not exist. So culture, to me, is a feature of changes in the mediatization of religion and science. Even with this more restricted focus, the intertwined networks of cultural distribution that make out the cultural veins and nerves of modern societies were already being forged in the period with which this workshop is concerned. Focusing on the notion of public spheres is an excellent way to study such networks of cultural flow. The traces are available to us primarily through the periodical and print cultures of the time, and indeed any genealogy of modern occulture must trace the relationship between the journals, books, publishers, magazines, and lecture circuits of the occult public subsphere and the various institutions of the public sphere at large. Such relationships can be demographic, so who is writing where and who is reading what, but they can also be topical, what issues are being discussed, or they can be, what I would say, epidemiological. So from where do specific themes emerge? How do they spread and mutate? And in what directions do references flow and move throughout these networks of communication? So these very general methodological considerations will, in this talk, serve to frame a specific case study that addresses the following question. What is the relationship between the scientific public sphere of the early 20th century and the occult public sphere? More specifically, what links exist between scientific and occult publication forums? How are topics treated across these forums? And what are the interests that inform articulations of science in the periodical occulture, more specifically? Before moving into the material, however, I wish to present three interrelated theses that I hope to illustrate with my case study. The first thesis is that the boundaries between the popular intellectual and the occult public spheres in this period do exist, but that they are porous. So boundaries are real in the sense that we may speak about separate institutions using different channels of distribution, associated also with different degrees of cultural capital and prestige. But in terms of the issues that are dealt with, there is much overlap between these domains. For example, the Gifford Lectures on Natural Theology or articles in the Herbert Journal enjoy a high cultural status tied to the cultural capital of the institutions that produce them and the social rank of their authors, which are often professors and bishops and lords and knights. But the problems that they address, and also often some of the solutions that are being proposed, do not differ markedly from those discussed in, for example, the Occult Review or the Quest. So I think this is actually not a very controversial point for most scholars anymore, but it's worth stressing. Second point is that when you look at popular science, so popular science, at least in the British context in this period, was an arena where scientists could prop up their research programs and win prestige and legitimacy through enlisting the support of publics and cultural power brokers. Science communication often focus on controversial and attention-grabbing problems that, strictly speaking, go beyond the strict sort of results of the science itself. So it could be about the implications for our worldviews, for religion and spirituality, or it could be about speculative future applications. So my second thesis is that these strategic communications of scientists often create bridges to the occult public sphere as well. And I want to illustrate that. My third point is that disputes over the interpretation of science tends to divide occultists. So to begin with, there is a general ambiguity about what is construed as mainstream science within sort of the occultist press. Is it a threat or is it a resource to spirituality? But there is also an internal tension between occultist positions which roughly follows the positions taken on specific tokens of mainstream science. So in discussing these issues, occultists tend to mobilize popular scientific resources to serve shifting strategic ends within the occult milieu, much in the same way as scientists themselves do when they produce those popular scientific resources. So those are sort of the general opening remarks. But so the subject of science and occultism in this period is now hardly untrodden ground. Myself, I wrote a 600-page book about this. And so there is also an abundance of cases that one could choose for discussing it. Now, I've chosen to focus on the activities of a slightly lesser known, but nevertheless, I think, important figure, namely the chemist, educator, and occultist intellectual Herbert Stanley Redgrove. Born in 1887, Redgrove attained a BSc from the University of London in 1907 and became a fellow of the Chemical Society. He taught chemistry and mathematics at London Polytechnic and then at West Ham Municipal Institute. As an educator, he had also a keen interest for geometry, teaching both on the college and the high school levels, and also producing several textbooks, both in chemistry and in geometry and mathematics. So you can see two of the books here. And his passion for educating people in science and mathematics extended also, as we shall see, to the world of occultists. So, but in the history of occultism, Redgrove is perhaps best known for his long-lasting and scholarly interest in the subject of alchemy. In 1911, he published Alchemy, Ancient and Modern, which dismissed the spiritual alchemy thesis, treated the subject historically, emphasized its physical as well as its mystical sides, and, what was truly original, related ancient attempts at transmutation to the transmutation discourse that was currently raging in physical chemistry following the discovery of radioactivity. In fact, this very aspect was presented as the rationale for the book. So in the opening pages, Redgrove states, recent experimental research has brought about profound modifications in the scientific notion regarding the chemical elements, blah, blah, blah. A certain resemblance can be traced between these later views and the theories of bygone alchemy. And then he goes on to quote recent research in radioactivity, saying that this suggests the possibility of realizing the old alchemistic dream and the transmutation of the base metals into gold. Now, when a second edition of this work appeared in 1922, Arthur Edward Waite praised the book, writing that he regarded it as the best introduction to the subject available in any language, and that he had very much hoped that it had been, or wished that it had been available to him when he first started reading up on alchemy. So Waite and Redgrove had already at this point been working together through the Alchemical Society. Redgrove had been involved in establishing this short-lived but influential group in 1912, acting as its president until it was dissolved due to the war in 1915. The Alchemical Society was itself an excellent example of a blended public sphere arena where scientists, occultists, and historians could discuss various aspects of alchemy, the nature of matter, and its relation to spirituality in sort of a common shared social arena, a public sphere arena. Redgrove's interest in the occult, however, ranged much wider than alchemy. Just some examples. His Bygone Beliefs, published in 1920, was an eclectic history of esotericism, we would say today, aiming to understand and appreciate, quote, at their true worth, some of the more curious byways along which human thought has traveled, unquote. And he wanted to do this in a sympathetic manner, showing that, you know, it's weird, but it makes sense in some way. And actually, a few years before this, he had attempted to put some of those byways into the heart of legitimate knowledge. What's this now? Okay. Yeah. With this 1915 monograph, The Magic of Experience, which came with a foreword by the physicist and SPR luminary William Barrett. So the book was an attempt at doing philosophy, arguing for a position of idealistic or rational empiricism. It was a staunch defense of what Redgrove took to be the inductive method of science, tempered by a brand of illuminationist skepticism that is kind of reminiscent of Cornelius Agrippa in the De Humanitate Scientiarum, which basically holds that absolute truth is unknowable by the senses and by reason alike, but it can be reached by a form of divine revelation that kind of supports it. So hence, Redgrove looks to Böhme and above all to Swedenborg for examples of mysticism that completes the world picture. He also, which is quite interesting, compared the proper inductive method of science to magic. Quote, inductive reasoning is in a sense a magic ritual, whereby fuller or higher revelation becomes possible. But the data of experience are the symbolic elements of this ritual, without which it cannot be performed or its production obtained. So knowledge is not really built up from these base observations, but kind of invoke this higher illumination that comes from above. Now, all of this suffices to paint the picture of a professional science educator with a passion for learning, a serious commitment to esotericism as an integral part of knowledge acquisition, and good connections in the worlds of science, occultism, psychical research, and publishing. I now want to highlight his central role in what was perhaps, as we have heard already, the most important institution of British periodical culture in the early 20th century, namely the Occult Review. So the Occult Review was central not just due to its high publication frequency and ability to enlist key personalities in the occult milieu, but also for creating a public sphere platform by discussing publications from across the occult milieu as well as outside of it. So through editorials and letters and book reviews, it participated in key discussions of the times. Moreover, a separate section on periodical literature, I think you can see that bottom there. So a section on periodical literature reported on various recent discussions in other publications, both occult and mainstream. It's really drawing together all these things that are floating around in the culture at the time. The Occult Review was, of course, part of the publishing empire of its editor, Ralph Shirley, the main engine of which was the publishing house William Ryder and Sons. Now, Shirley was also a member of Redgrove's Alchemical Society, and Redgrove himself published monographs with Ryder. So he was also a very frequent contributor to the Occult Review, and between 1908 and 1940, Redgrove published no fewer than 244 items in the journal, including letters, reviews, and articles. So we now move in on his role in the Occult Review. So while Redgrove's contributions covered a broad spectrum of topics, from ceremonial magic and alchemy to the history of Rosicrucianism, I wish to focus on Redgrove as a gatekeeper to the sciences. Through his extensive reviews and essays on science-related books, Redgrove occasionally opened the gates by introducing scientific concepts to an occult audience. But his critical educationalist stance also meant that he policed the correct interpretation and use of science in occult discourse, or what he took to be the correct interpretation. So in the rest of this paper, I will discuss a few examples from the pages of the Occult Review, bringing into focus the three theses that I discussed at the beginning. So the porous boundaries of the occult and the scientific public spheres, the strategic role of science communication, and the effects that this strategic role has had on the internal structuration of the occult milieu. Now, Redgrove's writings in the Occult Review demonstrate the porous boundaries of the occult in two ways. First, he is the threshold figure who introduces novel concepts and findings from the sciences to the occultist literature. He introduces research in geometry, chemistry, and radioactivity, for example, but also appears to be the very first occultist to have shown any serious interest in the relativity theories in quantum mechanics in the 1920s. Second, he often has a keen eye for intellectual problems that are pervasive in the general intellectual discourse, such as the relations between subjectivity and objectivity, experience and representation, perception and reality, idealism and materialism, life and matter, and so on and so forth. A concrete example of this is his 1920 article on the problem of time and space. While the article does not present a clear argument of its own, it is notable in that it discusses very recent intellectual material in a sharp and critical manner. It is, to my knowledge, in fact, the very beginning of a slow occultist reception, at least in Britain, of relativity theory, mediated largely through Arthur Eddington's Space, Time and Gravitation, which also came out in 1920, which was the first popular treatment of the subject in English. Eddington was also the leading sort of British scientist who was actually working actively with verifying some of Einstein's predictions of the general theory. So Redgrove suspects, well, he writes about relativity theory, and he suspects that the general theory, quote, will be found very suggestive by the student of occultism, unquote, because it may be interpreted as saying that, quote, matter and its properties are nothing but peculiarities, local curves or kinks in space-time. Now this is something that he would continue to build on in later publications, so he would follow up this lead here in 1921, saying that, quote, the general theory of relativity is of the utmost importance and interest to the serious student of occultism, since by showing that the fundamental properties of matter may be explained geometrically, it has dealt a final blow at scientific materialism, unquote. And in 1922, Einstein's theory of relativity provides, I think, the means whereby philosophical idealism may be placed upon a scientific and impregnable basis. And again, in 1925, that, quote, the theory of relativity has shown materialism to be unnecessary and therefore false. So, I'll return to some of this later, but going back to the 1920 article, Redgrove was also able to combine the discussion of relativity with the discussion of another recent publication, which came out in the same year, namely Samuel Alexander's very difficult Gifford lectures, Space, Time and Deity, which is an obscure two-volume work of natural theology that would, over the coming decade, become the foundational text of what is now called emergentism. So the anti-reductionist philosophical theory that the universe produces emergent properties through complex organization, which cannot be predicted or explained in terms of the mechanistic interactions of the components alone. So the sum is more than, the whole is more than the sum of its part, kind of thing. Like relativity theory, emergentism would go on to have a significant influence on esoteric thinking in the post-war period, so like a couple of generations later, particularly through other vehicles, such as Whitehead's process philosophy, which, by the way, was also given as Gifford lectures, and Teilhard de Chardin's evolutionary millennialist theory of the omega point, which has sort of emergentist properties to it. But in the 1920s occult public sphere, Redgrove appears to have been the only person seriously engaging these ideas, even though he was kind of dismissive and even criticizing them for failing to accommodate the views of time and space coming out of contemporary physics, which was his main focus. But he was discussing these things and seems to have been the only one. Now, Redgrove appears to have had a similar role with regards to quantum physics. His 1929 article on science and the universe is the first reference that I have found in the British context to the then emerging discourse of quantum mechanics on indeterminacy and skepticism towards causality or against causality. And again, this is wedded to an understanding of the new physics as pointing toward idealism and even mysticism. Again, the vehicle of these ideas is Arthur Eddington. And once again, it is a Gifford lecture. The immensely influential Nature of the Physical World, which was published in 1928. So it should be observed that the references to idealism and mysticism that Redgrove attaches to the new physics are actually found in Arthur Eddington's own book. So Redgrove's use of these kind of connections is not simply a matter of a creative interpretation by the occultist press. It's actually a shared interest of the mainstream intellectual public sphere that you find in the scientific, in the science communication by scientists. So, so far we have been focusing on the introduction of ideas, but Redgrove also functioned as a gatekeeper who policed right and wrong uses of science within the occult public sphere. Reviewing books on the fourth dimension, for example, he complained about the nonsense, this is his words, the nonsense that is published on this subject by theosophical and spiritualist authors, preferring instead serious work by mathematicians, especially that of Minkowski, who again tied it up to relativity theories. So moreover, his critique of the spiritual alchemy thesis was also carried on scientific grounds in addition to historical ones, and we already saw this in his Alchemy, Ancient and Modern. But it is also evident from his exchange with the Freemason Walter Leslie Wilmshurst over his introduction to the new edition of Marianne Atwood's Suggestive Inquiry into the Hermetic Mystery. And so Wilmshurst's introduction was very dismissive of Redgrove, Waite, and the Alchemical Society, and defending the spiritual alchemy thesis. So replying in a letter to the Occult Review, Redgrove uses science, among other things, to attack Wilmshurst's understanding of transmutation. So he writes, for example, here that, quote, what he has to say, so what Wilmshurst has to say about the subject of metallic transmutation well illustrates the danger of those who know little or no physical science venturing to treat of it, and more especially to criticize its findings. Of course, implying that the only person who can really criticize and understand these things is the man of science who has this education. So, there is, however, a bigger point to be made about the way that Redgrove develops scientific knowledge to polemical ends. This ties in with the two last theses that I introduced at the outset, that public science communication serves a strategic role, and that these strategic uses tend to have a productive, creative effect in differentiating various schools or positions when assimilated in the occult discourse. So now, as we have already seen, Redgrove identifies the new physics with idealism and the old physics with materialism. We have also seen that his main source for these differentiations are the popular writings of professional scientists, so especially Arthur Eddington. Now, this is a crucial point because the very idea that there is a new physics in the first place, which breaks revolutionarily with the past, and that it is idealistic and anti-deterministic and in other ways philosophically salient, was very much a product of a generational conflict within the profession of physics, along with the battle for its cultural position during the interwar period when terms such as materialism, mechanism, and determinism were becoming charged with negative connotations in the cultural as well as the political discourse of the times. So in occult milieus, the opposition to materialistic science has, of course, a much longer history, as we know. And there is even some evidence that some of the public scientists that were now trying to align physics with philosophy and anti-reductionism and anti-materialism were actually also drawing some resources from these occult ideas. In any case, it became easy to adopt the rhetoric of the new sciences to occultist internal polemics due to this convergence. Now, the problem, however, is that occultist doctrines in the shape of theosophy, spiritualism, and anthroposophy had already been solidifying around 19th century scientific concepts that were now becoming targets of the new physics. And I think there is no better illustrative example of this than the debate over ether physics. So we already saw that Redgrove was a pioneer in introducing aspects of the relativity and quantum theories to an occult audience in the 20s, just as he had been a pioneer in introducing radioactivity in the 1910s. This, however, brought him into direct conflict with the majority of esoteric science enthusiasts who followed the distinguished but distinctly 19th century ether physicist Sir Oliver Lodge, who continued to channel Victorian science well into the 1930s. While a new generation of physicists were producing popular books on cutting-edge developments in cosmology and microphysics, Lodge was still writing popular books on 19th century ether mechanics, often allied to metaphysical speculations on the nature of mind and the survival of personality after death. Institutionalized occultisms tended to favor Lodge to the new kids on the block. So there was, for example, an enthusiastic reception of Lodge's views on the ether in the Occult Review, following his Ether and Reality, which was published in 1925. At this time, ether theories had already been something of an anachronism among physicists for about 20 years. Yet, a number of central occultist authors celebrated it as a novel breakthrough. So, for example, Edith Harper favorably reviewed Ether and Reality when it appeared, finding, quote, parallels and correspondences in which the transcendentalist finds infinite suggestion, unquote. And Ralph Shirley also devoted an editorial to the book, or discussed it in an editorial, also in 1925, in which he rather confusedly, I have to say, portrayed the reality of ether as a new and recent scientific understanding that signifies a return to spiritual views of antiquity against the materialism of the preceding century. But the enthusiasm for ether theories doesn't stop there. So in 1926, for example, Meredith Starr was so inspired by ether physics that he wrote a poem about it. "O spirit of the ether, subtlest flame, and servant of the demiurgic name, vibrant with music heard but by the soul, O spiritual essence of the whole, the grave and womb of things, the gate of change, O fiery whirlwind sweeping through the range of all creation, bearing up the stars, self-conscious in the loftiest avatars of the All-One, O living, breathing wind of inspiration, kindling in the mind of the aspirant, ever-burning fire in the vast temple of the world's desire, flaming through all the caverns of the air, O rose of light that blossoms everywhere, filling the world with fragrance, sweetest song, heard in the guarded silence of my heart, bearer of bliss that healeth every smart." That's just one of the verses. It goes on for a couple of pages. So Redgrove appears to have been the only voice in the Occult Review who provided any resistance to Sir Oliver's old ideas. The key here is that Redgrove interpreted Lodge's worldview in a way that contradicts Lodge's own understanding and those of his followers. So while Harper, Shirley, and the rest saw Lodge's ether metaphysics as a spiritualization of the cosmos, Redgrove found it just another species of materialism. The underlying issue here is with the understanding of the new physics, as a review of Lodge's own book about relativity clearly shows. So this is now also from the Occult Review 1925, quote, "As an exponent of relativity, Sir Oliver Lodge suffers from the disability that he does not really, that is, wholeheartedly believe in it." You can hear that he wants to say he doesn't really understand it. He belongs to the school of thought, and it is really the school of materialism, though Sir Oliver would, of course, deny that he was a materialist, that requires certain artifices as ether, gravitation, and so on, in a word, objective reality, in order to think about experience. The relativist, on the other hand, belongs to the school whose members have asked themselves the question, are these symbols, these aids of thought, really necessary? And have found that they can get along very nicely without them. The belief in objective reality, reality outside the mind, outside experience, whether we call that reality matter, ether, or even spirit, is materialism. This line of criticism continued in a later article entitled The Apotheosis of Ether, which responded to Lodge's book Beyond Physics from 1930. In it, Lodge attempted to lay out a theory that would unify the phenomena of life and mind with those of physics, doing so through the ever-expanding notion of the ether, which was now becoming, quote, the vehicle of supreme mind, unquote. While Redgrove expressed mild sympathies for Lodge's intentions, for his intentions, the purpose of the article is once again to show that what Lodge calls idealism is really still materialism. Quote, Lodge, by his own confession, belongs to the older school of physicists to whom mechanical models were essential to the construction of the theory of the universe. Lodge admits that the old mechanical or engineering ether is extinct, but the ether which he apotheosizes is still something essentially physical and objective. The theory that ether is the underlying reality of the universe is a species of materialism. In other words, it is a belief in the reality of a creation of man's mind, rather than in that of experience. This, as I conceive it, is what materialism essentially is. So for Redgrove, Lodge equals old physics equals materialism, while the new physics equals idealism. The operative notion of idealism in Redgrove's understanding is that mind, subjectivity, and experience is primary, and the essence of the objects of thought and perception, whatever else they are, is to be perceived. And he quotes Berkeley many times on this point. So reification of the objects of thought is basically what materialism is all about. Now, this no doubt puts Redgrove's brand of idealism at odds with most forms of occultism, particularly to the extent that they look for objective grounding in the natural sciences. It also introduces into occultism a polemical rift of different scientific styles that originates in the physical sciences themselves and in the professional science communication of the scientists of the time. And would later become very influential. I mean, this split would later become very influential also in alternative spiritualities. While it is unclear whether anyone actually followed Redgrove's lead during the interwar period, I haven't really found any evidence that he had much influence, he clearly stands as a harbinger of a change in orientation that would happen a generation later. With the remodeling of occultist ideas by the Beat generation and the hippies, sometimes aided by aging intellectuals and scientists of the generation that Redgrove introduced in the British occult press, seeing relativity theory and quantum physics as the basis of idealism and mysticism would eventually become part of the occultural mainstream, and that certainly is where it is today. So.